Hey everyone, Professor Jackson here. For the first week of 202, we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. So here's a quick video lecture. We'll do this every week. Sometimes there'll be more than one PowerPoint, depending on kind of how things are organized. But this week we're all going to be going through the endocrine system, which is Chapter 16. And then we'll discuss that the beginning of the lab meeting on Friday, and then go into some lab exercises related to the endocrine system. And then we'll end the lab on Friday by talking about the beginning of the next week's assignments. All right, so let's jump right in with the endocrine system. And for those of you that have never had a course with me before, I typically include at the beginning of my PowerPoints a Why This Matters section. And this is straight from your textbook and highlights kind of some important diseases or career opportunities related to that particular body system or the content of the chapter. I don't usually go over this, but there is a video in the PowerPoint here that you can watch on your own, particularly if you're interested in a little more information on this topic. All right, so beginning in slide 4, kind of an overview of the endocrine system. When we think of the endocrine system, we usually think of glands, and we kind of compare and contrast the endocrine system to the nervous system because they're both involved with communication. And then we compare the endocrine glands to the exocrine glands. So if you remember from BIO201, an exocrine gland is going to include its own ductwork system and will secrete its contents onto the surface of something. So for example, the sebaceous glands or the sudoriferous glands, so sweat and oil glands, they secrete via their own ducts onto the surface of the skin. Those are not endocrine, they're exocrine. Endocrine glands are going to secrete whatever their chemical contents into the bloodstream. And anytime we have these chemical communicators that go into the bloodstream, we call them hormones. Okay? So when you think of endocrine system, think about it uses the blood instead of having its own ducts, and it's going to secrete hormones to communicate over long distances through the body. So the endocrine system acts with the nervous system to coordinate various activities and integrate activity of the body cells. It influences metabolic activities via those hormones that move via blood, and responses are slower but longer lasting than the nervous system. So when we think of the nervous system, we think very quick, very rapid response, but the response doesn't last as long. When we think of the endocrine system, typically we think of slower response. Now, hormones can still be a somewhat fast response, it's just relatively slower relative to the nervous system. So think the nervous system, think of some kind of a reflex, like when I tap my knee, like in the doctor's office, when you tap the knee to check that reflex, it happens instantaneously, very fast. Or when I see something like a ball's moving towards my head and I instantly move my face, that would be a quick nervous system reaction. An endocrine system reaction might be like there's an increased level of sugar in my blood, so I need to have insulin tell my body cells to pull in some of the sugar to be used for energy. Okay, so here's a nice little compare and contrast chart from table 16.1 from your book, comparing the nervous system and the endocrine system. So think nervous system, fast acting. Endocrine is a little bit slower, relatively speaking. Neurotransmitters that the nervous system use are chemicals, kind of like hormones, except for these neurotransmitters are going to be over very short distances. So think like across the neuromuscular junction between a nervous system cell and a muscle. Okay, where hormones are going to be able to travel from, say, the pancreas, where insulin is made, to travel to all sorts of cells throughout your body via the bloodstream. All right, so the endocrine system controls a lot of different important functions of the body. So it affects a lot of different cell types. In fact, probably most cell types in your body. So that would include functions like reproduction. Usually that's what we first think of when we think hormones, but it does a whole lot more. Also growth and development, maintenance of electrolytes, water balance, and the balance of nutrients in the blood, regulation of different cell metabolisms and the energy balance within the cells and throughout the whole body, as well as mobilization of different body defenses. Okay, so we're going to talk about, through the remainder of this entire class, we'll talk a lot about how various hormones affect different body systems. And if you remember back to, for example, the bone chapters of 201, different hormones played a major role in calcium deposition, adding calcium into the bones. Okay, so things like growth and development can be affected by these hormones. in that case, growth and development of the bones. Okay, so as I mentioned, exocrine versus endocrine. Think exocrine glands produce non-hormonal substances like sweat or saliva and have some kind of duct, their own duct work, to carry the secretion to the surface of the membrane, like the surface of the skin. Endocrine glands produce hormones and they lack ducts. Endocrine glands, examples would include pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid, the adrenal, the pineal. We'll go through all those in detail. As well as the hypothalamus, all right? And it's a very special organ. It's actually neuroendocrine, and we'll talk a little bit more about how the hypothalamus works. You may remember some details of it from the nervous system chapters of 201. And then we have several exocrine and endocrine organs that have dual functionality that do both exocrine and endocrine things. And so that would include the pancreas, the gonads, which are the reproductive organs, the primary reproductive organs, that's the ovaries and the testes, as well as the placenta. And we'll talk more about the gonads and the placenta in the last couple chapters as we get near the end of the semester. Other tissues and organs that may produce hormones include fat cells. We call those adipose cells, if you remember from the connective tissue unit back in chapter 4. The thymus also produces some hormones. And the cell walls of the small intestine, stomach, kidneys, and heart may produce some typically more locally acting hormones, but they're still technically hormones. And so here's kind of a general overview. You can see the testes and the ovaries, which would be the gonads. You can see the pancreas, the adrenal gland, which sits on either side above either kidney, the thymus, the parathyroid gland, which is right behind the thyroid. Here's the thyroid. And then the pineal gland and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are all in the brain or right adjacent to the brain. So chemical messengers of the endocrine system, we already mentioned hormones, okay? But we also have a few other terms that I want to make sure you're clear that you understand the difference between. They're very similar, but it simply has to do with where these different chemicals interact, where they're produced, and how close by they affect target cells. So the different chemical messengers within the endocrine system include hormones, autocrines, and paracrines. A hormone is simply a chemical that goes over a long distance. So think it travels through the bloodstream or the lymphatic fluid. An autocrine, remember auto means self, so autocrines actually are released by a cell and then affect the cell that released it. So they are self hormones essentially. Instead of having to travel through the bloodstream, they get secreted locally and the cell responds itself to whatever is secreted. Okay. Then paracrines are kind of in between the two. They act locally, very often even to similar cells of the same cell type or within the same tissue, rather than having to go through the bloodstream. So for example, a cell releases a hormone and it causes a change in all of the nearby cells. That would be para, meaning almost or nearby. So paracrines, autocrines would be self-acting, and then hormones over longer distances. For example, insulin is secreted by the pancreas, and that affects muscle cells in the arm. That's not anywhere nearby. So autocrines or paracrines, autocrines and paracrines are local chemical messengers, are technically not part of the endocrine system, but they're important to understand the difference and distinction between those and hormones. And so when we talk about hormones, we talk about two major groups of hormones. All right, and we'll try to make this a little simpler than the way the book explains it. You pretty much can think about it's all about the chemistry. So if you remember back to chapters 2 and 3, we talked a lot about, in 201, we talked a lot about things being liking water or liking fats, okay? Or we say hydrophilic, water-loving, hydrophobic, or lipophilic, meaning water-hating, or lipid, fat-loving, okay? And so depending on what the hormone is made of, a hormone is just any chemical that causes communication, that hormone is either going to be fat-like or it's going to be non-fat-like, okay? Something that likes water much better. And typically the ones that like water much better are going to be some type of amino acid derivative, so kind of related to proteins and peptides, okay? So the two classes of hormones would be amino acid-based or steroid-based, and steroids are types of lipids, okay? All steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol, all right? And we'll talk a little bit about good versus bad cholesterol, but cholesterol is necessary for hormones. And so we have gonadal and adrenocortical hormones, okay? So those would be the gonads, the ones produced by the ovaries and the testes, as well as those produced by the adrenal gland and the adrenal cortex. Those would all be steroid-based, made from cholesterol. That means they don't interact very well with the water-like environment of like the bloodstream, but they can pass easily in and out of the cell, which we'll talk about in a second, because the outside of the cell is fat, it's a lipid. The opposite is true of most amino acid-based hormones. Most amino acid-based hormones do great in water. They're hydrophilic, so they can move easily through the blood, but when they get to a target cell, they cannot easily pass into that cell. Okay? We're not really going to talk about eicosanoids. You may hear this term. You don't have to know it for the test. But if you see it, basically, it's sort of a paracrine-like possible hormone. We're not really going to focus on those for the purposes of 202 this year. All right, so the hormones circulate systemically through the entire body. Only cells with receptors for that hormone become affected. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's say that, for example, insulin, like we've mentioned, gets secreted by the pancreas. The main effect of insulin typically is to cause cells to take in sugar. Okay, so when your body detects that there's lots of sugar in your bloodstream, the pancreas secretes insulin and target cells, cells that could do metabolism of sugar to create energy, take in sugar to either store it or metabolize it and use it for energy right away. But let's say maybe there's certain cell types that we don't need to take in more sugar. It might cause a problem, all right? You might think this might be really important for something like testosterone or estrogen, which can cause different types of growth, okay? So it's very important that we only have certain cells respond to the hormone. And the way that's accomplished is by those amino acid-based hormones that are not able to easily pass inside of the cell. Basically, they only respond when there's a specific target substance that can recognize the shape of the hormone. All right. So most hormones, particularly amino acid-based hormones, are going to target specific cells. We call those target cells because there is a receptor, okay, a chemical receiver essentially recognizes the hormone and can cause some kind of an action. All right. So that's not very different from when we think about, like when we talked about the muscles or the nervous system in 201, and there were different receptors that could receive, for example, the neurotransmitter. All right. A hormone, when it gets to the target cell, can do lots of different things. All right. And it all depends on what the target is and a specific cell type. They respond differently to different hormones. So one possibility is it could alter the plasma membrane permeability or membrane potential. So maybe it opens up an ion channel and lets things pass through. That's kind of like a neurotransmitter that we've already talked about. But that can happen in other cell types for different reasons. It could maybe make it easier for certain substances like the sugar we mentioned to be taken into the cell. So in the case of insulin, it causes glucose receptors to actually open up and channels for glucose to let sugar run into the cell when the insulin opens up those receptors. It can also stimulate the synthesis of specific proteins like enzymes. Okay, we have lots of glucose. Let's make all of the enzymes needed to process glucose via cellular metabolism. All right, so we can use that for energy with oxygen. It can sometimes activate or deactivate enzymes. This happens a lot. We don't always need to be able to process food, so sometimes we turn off some of those enzymes. And then we wait until we need to actually process food to turn the enzymes back on again. We can induce different types of secretions. Okay, so remember one of the functions of epithelial cells, like in your gut, is to have secretions, like enzyme secretions. Or perhaps in other parts of the body, like an exocrine organ, it might cause oil to be secreted or sweat to be secreted because you're hot. And then finally, it can also stimulate mitosis, which, if you remember, mitosis is the cell cycle portion where we're actually making new cells. So it's time to make new bone cells, for example, or new red blood cells. All right? So those are just some examples of the things that a hormone can actually do or trigger a cell to do when it gets to its target cell. So hormones typically act in one of two ways, right? And as I mentioned, it basically depends on whether they're water soluble, hydrophilic, they like water, or lipid soluble, hydrophobic, they don't like water. Those that are water soluble or hydrophilic can actually basically cannot pass through the plasma membrane, the cell membrane on the outside of the cell, because it's lots of lipid, lots of fat. The one exception there would be thyroid hormone, which we'll talk about later. Thyroid hormone acts more like a lipid hormone. The rest of the amino acid-based hormones are all water soluble. So what happens, they get to the cell membrane on the target cell, and there's no way for that hormone to enter inside of the cell. So it can't change anything unless there is a receptor sitting on the plasma membrane surface that can recognize that hormone. If there is, then it's going to use what we call G protein second messengers and actually affect a process inside of the cell. And we'll go through that in just a second, what a G protein is and how second messengers work. In the case of lipid-soluble hormones, so steroids plus thyroid hormone, they basically act on intracellular receptors. So once the hormone reaches the target cell, it can easily pass right through the cell membrane, and once it gets inside, it could change the expression of a protein, or it could change the activation state of a protein, or open up an ion channel, what have you. So when we think about plasma membrane receptors, or the second messenger system that has to exist for those water-loving hydrophilic systems, those types of hormones, we think about second messengers. Okay, so what we mean by a second messenger is the hormone is the first messenger that gets the message to the outside of the cell, and then a receptor receives the signal and causes some other molecule inside of the cell to actually cause a change in the cell process. Okay, a second messenger. So there are two main second messenger systems that we use. There's others that exist, but these are the two main ones that we're going to focus on here in 202. The first is called cyclic AMP, all right, and the second is called PIP2, and that involves calcium. And so if you look at your study guide, this is an important maybe side note here, make sure you look at your study guide to understand the depth of information that you need to understand each sort of section. I do give you weekly the details of a study guide, and that should help focus exactly what you want to learn and what you want to know. I may go a little more in depth from time to time on the videos and the PowerPoint just because it may help you understand the really important information. Okay, so let's talk a little about how these two second messenger systems work and look at kind of a diagram that may help you understand them. So first, cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP, so adenosine monophosphate is what the AMP is. So that may sound familiar because of ADP and ATP. Remember, ATP is cellular energy. Well, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. ADP is diphosphate. AMP is monophosphate. So basically what happens with cyclic AMP is it's a special derivative of ATP. Okay, and so the ATP actually becomes a circle, its structure changes a little bit, and loses some phosphates in the process and becomes cyclic AMP. Okay, and if you think about it, most cells in your body have lots of ATP sitting around because we use it for energy. It's the main energy currency of the body. So cyclic AMP is useful, and it's a very easy second messenger to generate anytime a hormone triggers the activation of the second messenger. Okay, so how do we make cyclic AMP? So first, the hormone, or first messenger, is going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell, okay, on the plasma membrane. This is going to activate what's called a G protein, okay, and the G protein is either going to activate or inhibit different effector enzymes in the cell that ultimately use the enzyme called adenylate cyclase. This is the enzyme that converts ATP to cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP can go change different things in the cell and turn on whatever process is the target of the hormone. Okay, so we have the first messenger, the hormone binds to the receptor turns on a G protein, the G protein is going to activate adenylate cyclase, which makes cyclic AMP from ATP. Then the cyclic AMP can act like a second messenger and change something inside of the cell. All right, so the phosphorylated protein, the cyclic AMP, can usually turn on what we call a kinase. Okay, that's simply an enzyme that phosphorylates something, adds a phosphate group, and this typically is a signaling cascade that can have different effects inside of the cell and change major processes. When the signaling is done, we can actually use what's called the phosphodiesterase to convert cyclic AMP back into, ultimately it'll eventually become ATP again. Basically we have the target change we want to have inside the cell. So here's a nice little picture of that. The hormone, this little the kind of pink color ball here, is floating through the bloodstream. Okay, it gets to a local cell, maybe via capillary, and gets into the interstitial fluid, the extracellular fluid. It attaches to this receptor, which is in purple. Okay, you can see it's on the outside of the cell and on the inside of the cell. Here's the cell's plasma membrane, and if you remember, it has the hydrophobic tail portions that prevent things from sliding through easily from the outside fluid or the inside fluid. So the hormone binds to the receptor. The receptor then is activated and activates this G protein. Okay, when the G protein is active, it's going to turn on adenylate cyclase, which makes cyclic AMP. And the cyclic AMP goes and does something inside of the cell. So here's a nice little simple way of looking at what happens. The second version is still a second messenger. It's going to make something that can change inside of the cell, but it does it in a different way. It doesn't use cyclic AMP. Instead, it uses something we call PIP2. Okay, and PIP2 is also going to involve calcium. So what happens is the hormone still activates a G protein, okay, but instead of activating adenylate cyclase, it's going to activate phospholipase C, or sometimes we call it PLC. And this phospholipase, okay, so if you stop and think phospholipid, like the phospholipid bilayer, it's an ACE, meaning it's an enzyme that triggers that probably it's going to catalyze the breakdown of a phospholipid. And in fact, that's what it does. It breaks down a phospholipid instead of making cyclic AMP. So what happens is the phospholipase C is going to split a molecule called PIP2. It's a phospholipid, and it's going to be split into two pieces. We call them DAG and IP3. DAG stands for diacylglycerol. You don't have to know the long form. And IP3 stands for inositol triphosphate. Again, you only have to know IP3. Okay, so in this case, phospholipase C or PLC will split PIP2 into DAG and IP3. The result inside of the cell of DAG is it can turn on signaling cascades. Different protein kinases get turned on to affect cell processes. The effect of IP3 is it causes calcium to be released from intracellular storage sites like the endoplasmic reticulum. And calcium can cause changes within the cell. That also can be like another second messenger. So calcium can alter enzyme activity. So if you remember from muscles, we talked about troponin, tropomyosin, calmodulin. Okay, same idea. We can have calcium acting like an inhibitor, or when calcium is absent, an activator in different cell processes. Okay, there are a lot of other cell signaling mechanisms that can exist. You can have cyclic GMP as a second messenger for some hormones. Some actually work without a second messenger system, and basically the hormone turns on the receptor, which can basically cause the change. All right, but we're going to focus on those two: the PIP2 calcium system and the cyclic AMP system as second messengers downstream of hydrophilic hormones, or the water-soluble peptide amino acid-based hormones, the ones that can't make it inside of the cell themselves. All right. Then with lipid-soluble hormones or steroid-based hormones, we can actually directly change something inside the cell, like turn on a gene, because the lipid-soluble steroid hormones can make it inside of the cell. The receptor hormone complex where there's still a receptor in the hormone, enter into the nucleus, okay, the inside where the DNA is kept inside of the cell, and bind to specific regions of DNA. This helps to cause DNA transcription to produce mRNA, and then mRNA then is translated into specific proteins. So for example, let's say that we need to have a specific enzyme to process the sugar that's in milk. It's called lactose, okay? The enzyme is called lactase. We could possibly turn that on if we have a hormone that's a steroid-based hormone because it's able to enter inside of the cell and then ultimately enter inside the nucleus and bind with the DNA and turn on expression of that gene to make mRNA, which will make the protein, the lactase enzyme, that can break down or digest the lactose sugar in milk. So here's a nice picture of that. You see the steroid-based hormone is able to cross the plasma membrane without a problem. It binds to some kind of a receptor inside of the cytoplasm, just inside somewhere in the cell, and together they can go inside of the nucleus and affect what proteins are going to be expressed, what proteins are made inside of the cell. All right, if you want to hear somebody else explain this a little differently than the way I did, and possibly a little more depth even, feel free to watch this little A&P Flicks. It's also available on Mastering A&P if you want to look through the films, try to find the little videos that are available. Okay, so hormones. Hormones basically are going to be released into the bloodstream, okay, to affect some downstream target cell. So blood levels of hormones typically are actually controlled by a negative feedback system. So if you remember from the first chapter in 201, we talked about positive and negative feedback systems. If you remember, positive feedback is going to increase whatever the initial stimulus was. So for example, when a baby is about to be born, the head pushes against the birth canal. This causes ultimately the release of oxytocin. And once oxytocin is released, it causes the birth canal to open up some more. And that initiates the release of more oxytocin. So basically, the more oxytocin you get, the more oxytocin is going to be made. The more oxytocin that's made, the more oxytocin you're going to get. And so it's a positive feedback system. It keeps causing more and more to amplify the initial stimulus. In the case of hormones, they're typically controlled by negative feedback systems. So that's the opposite. That's when we're trying to stay in a homeostatic balance, in a normal range. Okay? So for example, the example we used in chapter 1 was when you're cold, right? Your body detects that the temperature is decreasing, and so ultimately your brain tells your body to shiver, and that's going to produce heat energy to balance out the temperature. Instead of your body getting colder, it gets warmer. Okay? So for the case of hormones, the increased hormone effects on target organs can inhibit further hormone release. So basically, if we want to trigger growth of bone cells, we release a hormone, and then the ultimate response of that hormone is not just to increase bone growth, but to actually block the release of more hormone so that we don't get too much growth too fast. So levels of hormone will vary only within a narrow range that's more desirable range. And the hormone release is either triggered by an endocrine gland stimulus or a nervous system modulation. So either the nervous system will turn on the hormone, turn on the endocrine gland to release the hormone, or another endocrine gland hormone will cause its stimulation. And so we'll go through some examples. So the endocrine gland stimulus. Endocrine glands are stimulated to synthesize and release hormones in response to either humoral stimulus. Okay, remember the word humors is the kind of old ancient word for blood. So some kind of something, a certain level of something sitting in your bloodstream can trigger release of a hormone. It can be neural stimulus, so the nervous system triggers the release, or it can be hormonal stimulus. Another hormone tells that endocrine gland to secrete a hormone. In the case of humoral stimulus, changes in blood levels of a different ion or some kind of a nutrient directly causes the stimulation of secretion of a hormone. Okay, so for example, if you have calcium in your blood, all right, the less calcium you have in your blood, it's going to really cause the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. Okay, so parathyroid hormone causes calcium concentrations to rise, and once there's more calcium in the blood, there's no longer a stimulus to secrete parathyroid hormone. So that's an example of the negative feedback that exists there in the case of a humoral stimulus. All right. And the parathyroid gland, we'll see this on Friday in the lab, sits actually inside of the thyroid. There's a different number of parathyroid glands with different individuals, but it sits right there. And it's going to detect how much calcium is in the blood. You can see this capillary right here is going to help it detect that. And once there's very little calcium, it's going to release parathyroid hormone. That's going to go through the bloodstream, cause calcium levels to increase in the blood. And once there's more calcium in the blood, there's no longer a stimulus for the parathyroid to release parathyroid hormone. All right, in the case of neural stimulation, the nerve fibers directly stimulate the hormone release. So kind of like when a nerve actually stimulates a muscle, same kind of idea here. Instead, the nerve is going to stimulate an endocrine gland, and the result is it releases a hormone instead of contracting. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for doing this. It stimulates things like the adrenal medulla to secrete catecholamines. All right, and so here's that example. So if you remember, the adrenal gland is that gland that sits right above the kidneys. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. And basically, the central nervous system right here is going to cause the release of some of those hormones. And then in hormonal stimulus, the hormones stimulate other endocrine organs to release their hormone. So for example, the hypothalamic hormones, so the hypothalamus, those hormones stimulate the release of most of the anterior pituitary's hormones. We'll go through how that works shortly. And so the anterior pituitary hormones stimulate targets to secrete even more hormones, and we end up with what we call the hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop. Okay, so it's kind of like an axis with the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and whatever the target endocrine organ is. Hormones from the final target, whatever the last organ is, actually block the release of hormones from the hypothalamus. Okay, so here you can see it's like a hormone triggers the release of a hormone, which triggers the release of another hormone. The final hormone blocks release of the first hormone. So again, it's a negative feedback loop. All right, and so here's an example. The hypothalamus releases a hormone which causes the anterior pituitary gland to release a hormone, and this is going to affect the thyroid, the adrenal gland, and different gonads like the testes and the ovaries. In turn, the final hormone is going to go back and block the hypothalamus from releasing more hormones. This is particularly important, like when we get into the reproductive chapter and talk about how puberty is initiated and how the monthly cycle works in female reproductive anatomy and physiology. All right, no matter what the system is, the nervous system has the ability to actually modulate the amount of hormone released. Okay, so it can adjust things a little bit to be more appropriate. It can modify stimulation or inhibition of the endocrine glands. The nervous system basically can override normal endocrine controls. This is particularly important for what we call the fight or flight response. So for example, under a severe stress, the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system override insulin to allow blood glucose levels to increase so that you have more energy available potentially for a fight or flight response. All right. So kind of the next section, we want to think about how do we get the target hormone from an endocrine gland to only affect its specific targets. So for example, when we release testosterone, how do we get testosterone to only affect its target cells? Or if you remember back to slide 32, we talked about the hypothalamus affects the anterior pituitary, and then the secretions of the anterior pituitary could affect the thyroid or the adrenal cortex or the testes. How do we determine when we want it to only affect the testes but not the adrenal cortex and the thyroid? Okay, so this is accomplished in several ways. We call that target cell specificity. All right, so for example, ACTH receptors are found only on certain cells in the adrenal cortex. By thyroxine receptors are found on pretty much every cell of the body. So which cells need to respond to thyroxine versus ACTH? So the target cell activation is going to depend on three different things. This is very important. The amount of the hormone that's in the blood, the relative number of receptors that are on the target cell. So what's its ability to actually respond based on how many places the hormone can bind to that cell. And then thirdly, its affinity or the strength of binding between the receptor and the hormone. How good of a chemical fit is it? Does it kind of initiate the receptor, or does it really, really turn on the receptor? All right, so blood levels, the relative number of receptors, and then its affinity or strength of binding between the receptor and hormone. So the amount of hormone can influence the number of receptors actually for the hormone. So if the cell is responding to the hormone, it's very common that we may upregulate or downregulate receptors on the target cell. So for example, let's say that the cell normally needs a certain hormone to tell it to survive or to grow. And if it doesn't detect very much of the hormone, it might upregulate or increase the receptors on its surface so that it has a higher chance anytime the hormone comes to the bloodstream to be able to respond. We call that upregulation. All right? Conversely, if something happens and the cell is already responding to a hormone, it's very possible that it may downregulate the receptors because it already has a major response and it doesn't want to get too much of a response, too strong of a response. So basically the result is it desensitizes the target cell to prevent them from overreacting to a persistently high level of hormone. This is what happens like in insulin resistance in diabetic patients, where actually the body may no longer respond as much to insulin because there's so much insulin already in the bloodstream and the cells can only take in so much sugar. All right? So hormones can circulate in the blood either freely or bound to different plasma proteins. In the case of the lipophilic or hydrophobic hormones like the steroids and the thyroid hormone, they have to actually attach to plasma proteins. Okay, they can't freely float through the bloodstream because they don't like water. The other hormones that are amino acid based that are hydrophilic can just move straight through the bloodstream and don't have to be bound to any other carrier protein or plasma protein. So the concentration of circulating hormone is basically going to be affected by the amount of release, so how much hormone is actually produced and put into the bloodstream, and then the speed at which the body actually removes that hormone. Okay, so how much we produce versus how much we take out of the bloodstream. And hormones can be removed from the blood by degrading enzymes, by the kidneys, or by the liver. And so we call the half-life the time required for the level of hormone in the blood to decrease by half. Okay, so for example, let's say that we have 3,000 molecules of a certain hormone in the blood. How long does it take us to get to 1,500 molecules? Okay, and assuming that cells aren't upregulating or downregulating their receptors, the response would be half when you have half as many individual hormones available for any target cell. Okay, so half-lives can be anywhere from like a small portion of a minute, maybe a few seconds, to like a week. And that just depends on the hormone. Some are designed to be around for much longer. Others get metabolized very quickly so that they're not causing an effect for very long. So again, a hormone, relatively speaking, the endocrine system and the hormones are longer acting than the nervous system. But within hormones, some are very short-term response, some cause a long-term response or a long-term effect. The duration of response is usually limited. It ranges from 10 seconds to several hours, and the effects may disappear rapidly as the blood levels drop, but some may still persist for hours even at low blood levels. Half-life, onset, and duration of the hormone activity are all going to be dependent on whether the hormone is water or lipid soluble. So again, it's very important what the chemical structure of the hormone itself is. Is it more water-like, or is it more water-loving, or is it going to be more lipid-loving, fat-loving? Okay, so here's some comparisons of the two, and this may be helpful for some of you to compare what a lipid hormone versus a water-soluble hormone looks like. All right, so when it gets to a target cell, what does a hormone do? Okay, so multiple hormones may actually act on the same cell at the same time. In fact, typically that's what happens. It's not like your body secretes only testosterone or only insulin or only TH, thyroid hormone. Instead, it's actually got different levels of most hormones at any given time. So, how do the hormones affect each other? Okay, so we say that they can be permissive. One hormone cannot exert its effect without another hormone being present. So basically, we have to have something to be able to see the effect of a hormone. So like a reproductive hormone needs thyroid hormone to actually do something. Without thyroid hormone, reproductive hormones are kind of pointless. It's one reason thyroid levels are very important. We can also have a synergistic effect. What does that mean? More than one hormone produces the exact same effect on the target cell. So if you get a lot of one hormone and a lot of the second hormone, you actually get amplification of the response. An example would be glucagon and epinephrine. Both will cause the liver to release glucose. So what happens if you're expressing glucagon and the hormones are floating through your bloodstream, and then all of a sudden you also start secreting epinephrine? You're going to get an even greater glucose release from the liver. And then finally you have antagonism, and this is basically where one hormone blocks the effect of the other. Insulin and glucagon are kind of opposite hormones. Insulin causes your cells to take in sugar. Glucagon causes them to release sugar. Okay, so if you have insulin and glucagon both present, it's kind of a net null effect. Okay, so we can either cause permissiveness, synergism, or antagonism when we have more than one hormone involved on a target cell. All right, so now we're going to go through some of the major endocrine glands and just look at kind of what they do, their important functions, and highlight a few of the specific hormones that are very important for the endocrine system. So first we have the hypothalamus, okay? The hypothalamus is going to be connected to the pituitary gland. You may hear this called the hypophysis, but we're going to call it the pituitary gland. And the connection point between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is called the infundibulum. All right, you may or may not have talked about that in 201. Typically, my classes don't really focus on the infundibulum. The pituitary is going to secrete at least 8 different hormones. All right, so this is very large. The hypothalamus is going to actually turn on the pituitary, and there's 2 parts of the pituitary which are important for releasing lots of different hormones. And this makes sense because, as we mentioned, there is a large amount of neuronal control, and the hypothalamus is part of the brain. So it's a major neural regulation center of the endocrine system. Okay, so within the pituitary, all right, within the pituitary we have 2 major lobes. We have the anterior and the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is actual neural tissue, so it's nervous system. The anterior pituitary is glandular tissue, so it's actual epithelium. All right, this is very important, and we'll look at this in lab on Friday. What's the difference in a slide? What does the anterior versus the posterior pituitary look like, and which one is going to be neural versus glandular epithelium? All right. So the posterior lobe is neural tissue derived from, basically, during development, it's derived from the brain itself. And it maintains connections directly to the hypothalamus. And it secretes 2 major neurohormones, oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So think posterior is neural, okay? And that causes the release of oxytocin, which is important for labor. We already mentioned that briefly. And antidiuretic hormone, okay, which, if you can imagine, it's an antidiuretic. So diarrhea is water release, okay? So antidiuretic prevents water release. So that's what the antidiuretic or ADH hormone does. All right. So the hormones that are inside of the posterior lobe, okay, because it's neural tissue, the hormones essentially get released much like the way a neurotransmitter gets released. They sit in vesicles and are ready to be released when they're stimulated by the nervous system. So here's a picture. You have the hypothalamus. Okay, the electrical signal runs down these neurons, and ultimately will go to the posterior lobe, which will cause the release of those hormones into the bloodstream. And so that's ADH and oxytocin. The anterior lobe is a glandular tissue, and it actually, believe it or not, comes from the oral mucosa, so from the area around the mouth. So it has blood connections, vascular connections to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus actually secretes a releasing and inhibiting hormone to affect the anterior pituitary. Okay, so again, here's the hypothalamus. It's directly connected by these different neurons to the posterior lobe of the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Excuse me, the posterior lobe of the pituitary. And then it has blood connections to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Okay, and the anterior lobe is going to be really important because it's going to secrete a lot of hormones that affect other parts of the body. Growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. FSH and LH in particular, we're going to talk about some more in the last few chapters with reproduction, and to some extent prolactin. All right, so the posterior pituitary consists of axon terminals of neurons from the hypothalamic neurons. I don't expect you to know all of those details, but I do expect you to recognize oxytocin and ADH both come from the neuronal section, from the posterior pituitary. Okay, they're very similar hormones, but have very different effects. They're peptide based. All right, oxytocin is a strong stimulant of uterine contractions. Okay, so important for childbirth, and is also important for milk ejection. So when mom is actually nursing, it'll help cause milk release. Both use positive feedback mechanisms. So it's very interesting. If you remember, most hormones and most systems in your body use negative feedback, but this hormone here, oxytocin, uses positive feedback. It acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain and uses that PIP2 calcium second messenger system. So if you remember, what happens there is the hormone, oxytocin, is going to go to target cell and cause the receptor to split. It's going to activate a G protein which splits the PIP2 phospholipid into DAG and IP3. And the IP3 will also cause release of calcium. All right, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Basically, the hypothalamus is going to be sensing what's going on with water levels in the body. We call those osmoreceptors. And if concentration of water is too high, the posterior pituitary may release ADH. So it targets the kidney tubules. We'll talk a little bit more about this system when we get into the urinary tract. And in the kidneys, they actually are going to resorb more water anytime you get release of ADH and prevent as much urine formation. The release can also be triggered by different types of pain, lower blood pressure, and some specific drugs that affect ADH. It's typically inhibited by alcohol and diuretics. So if you take a diuretic, it blocks ADH. That's one of the ways that you actually get more water release from the body. And if you have really high levels of ADH, it's going to actually cause vasoconstriction. So basically, if you think of constriction, like a boa constrictor squeezes, it's basically where you're going to squeeze or get smaller blood vessels. And we'll talk a little more about that when we get into the blood next week. All right, so here's a nice summary chart of the pituitary hormones, the anterior and posterior pituitary. So thinking about kind of homeostasis and how things can get out of whack when we have problems with these hormones, you can have diabetes insipidus that occurs when ADH deficiency happens when there's damage to the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary. Basically, you have to keep well hydrated or you start getting a form of diabetes. We can also have what's called syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. So basically, you're not getting ADH when you need to. It causes retention of fluid because you have too much ADH. It can cause headaches because too much fluid, and disorientation. So basically, when this happens, you have to monitor the amount of sodium, which we'll talk about later as we get into the urinary tract. Is very important for maintaining the amounts of water, and you block how much fluid is actually drank. Limit fluid intake. The anterior pituitary okay, like we mentioned, has 6 different hormones. They're all peptide based. So all the pituitary hormones, all 8 of them we've talked about, are peptide based, which means they require a second messenger. They can't easily cross into the cell on their own. All 6 of these are very important. All of them but growth hormone use the cyclic AMP second messenger. Growth hormone does not. All right, and all of them but 2 are what we call tropic hormones or tropins. Okay, and a tropin is simply a hormone that causes the release of another hormone. All right, so when we mentioned that one of the ways that an endocrine gland is stimulated is by other hormones, this would be by tropic hormones or by tropins. Okay. So growth hormone, which like it says, it initiates growth. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Growth hormone and prolactin are not tropic, all right? But thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone are all tropic. They all cause the release of other hormones. Growth hormone, sometimes it's called somatotropin. We'll just call it growth hormone for the purposes of this class. Basically affects metabolism, okay, both directly and indirectly. And so it indirectly causes growth to occur when there's increased growth hormone. So what happens is basically glucose-sparing actions decrease the rate of cellular glucose uptake and block metabolism. And so it is going to trigger the liver to break down glycogen into sugar, into glucose, and increase blood levels of fatty acids that can be used as fuel, which is in turn going to encourage cellular protein synthesis. So what this ultimately does is it triggers the liver, the skeletal muscle, and the bone to make more growth factors that are insulin-like growth factors, and basically stimulates formation of collagen and deposition of bone matrix, so you get increased bone growth, and you get cellular uptake of lots of different nutrients that are necessary to make more DNA and more protein, so you're able to make new cells. So GH stimulates most cells to enlarge and divide, but the main targets, the biggest one, would be the bone and the skeletal muscles. Okay, so growth hormone actually has a more direct effect on metabolism, which indirectly causes growth, particularly of bone and skeletal muscles. And that makes sense because growth, we think about the major times in our lives when we grow, the major organ systems that are going to do the most growth are going to be the bones, like the long bones, and various skeletal muscles. All right, and it's regulated by hormones that are very easily named: growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So as just the name says, GHRH causes the release of GH or growth hormone, and GHIH causes the inhibition or the blocking of the release of growth hormone. So here's a little picture showing how this would work. The hypothalamus could trigger the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, and it's going to affect various parts of the cells to affect metabolism and indirectly promote growth. All right, so hypersecretion, so too much secretion of GH is usually caused by a problem with the anterior pituitary, like a tumor. If you have too much GH secretion in children, you get gigantism. Okay, so basically formation of a giant, normally portioned body parts that just grow too big. We get too big overall. So someone like that has gigantism can be as large as 8 feet. If you get too much growth hormone in adults, typically you end up with acromegaly. And so this is basically where the extremities tend to grow more: the hands, the feet, and the face. So gigantism is in children. Acromegaly tends to happen in adults. Now what happens though if you don't get enough GH, not enough growth hormone? Hyposecretion. In children, you end up with pituitary dwarfism. Okay, so the child may only reach 4 feet in height, and in adults, typically there's no problem because growth hormone doesn't have to be as stimulated because we're not doing as much growth. Okay, so usually it's not a big deal. So here's an example of somebody in the center that has gigantism, and on the left, this individual has dwarfism. All right, the thyroid stimulating hormone, one of those other hormones, is a tropic hormone. Okay, so it's going to cause the release of other hormones. Sometimes it's called thyrotropin or thyrotropic hormone. We're just going to simply call it TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's going to initiate the release of thyroid hormone. It stimulates the normal development and secretory activities of the thyroid. Um, let's see. And so you can see here we kind of end up with an axis where the hypothalamus is going to make TRH, which is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to make thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, which is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce TH, thyroid hormone. And that's going to affect various target cells. Once you get an increase in thyroid hormone directly will block anterior pituitary for making TSH and the hypothalamus for making TRH. So again, it's a negative feedback loop. The more thyroid hormone that's produced, we're going to block the increase of TRH and TSH upstream. All right. Then we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Sometimes it's called corticotropin. And basically, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release various corticosteroids. So these are going to be fat-based corticosteroids that it produces, or lipid-based. And regulation of ACTH release is by corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. So you can see these names. When you see the name, you can think really quickly, oh, this probably causes the release or the inhibition of this specific hormone. Naturally, ACTH levels are going to be highest in the morning. Internal and external factors can alter the release of CRH, and that includes things like fever, hypoglycemia, and various stresses. And then we have what are called the gonadotropins. We'll spend a long time talking about these and the effects on both males and females when we get into chapters 26 and 27, and to some extent 28. So gonadotropins are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We usually just call them FSH and LH, okay? And they're gonadotropins because they cause the release of hormones by the gonads. So that's the ovaries and the testes, all right? And FSH and LH do roughly the same thing or the equivalent thing for males or females. FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, causes the production of the gametes, those specific sex cells, either the egg or the sperm, that are able to come together to make a new human being. Okay, so FSH causes the release of gametes, the egg or the sperm. And luteinizing hormone causes the production of the main gonadal hormones. Okay, so in males, that's testosterone. In females, that's going to be estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so that's really important. FSH produces the gametes, that's the egg and the sperm. LH is going to cause the release of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. LH and FSH are absent from the blood before puberty in boys and girls. And the regulation of gonadotropins is going to be triggered by what's called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That occurs during puberty and continues to be maintained after puberty. And we'll talk a little bit about the details of that again in chapter 26. And actually, what's interesting about FSH and LH is they are actually inhibited by the actual gonadal hormones. So if we have an increase in FSH and LH, that's going to cause the release in males of testosterone, and in females, progesterone and estrogen. The progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone in turn block the release of FSH and LH. So we only get so much at any given time. All right, prolactin, okay, it's secreted by some specific cells within the anterior pituitary and triggers the release of milk in female, the production of milk, and ultimately the release of milk in females. We don't really understand all of its effects in males, but it does do several things. And essentially this is actually under the control of dopamine. It's inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is triggered release by dopamine. So basically, prolactin is only released when it's needed, such as when you have decreased levels during active lactation. Okay. So actually, blood levels of prolactin increase right at the end of pregnancy before potential nursing, and then actually the baby suckling causes PRL or prolactin to be released, and to help with continued milk production until there's no longer prolactin levels in the blood. And we'll talk a little bit more about that again when we get to chapter 26 and 27. So hypersecretion of prolactin is more common than hyposecretion. So if you get hyper, that's too much. Hyposecretion is not really a problem except unless a woman is specifically trying to nurse the child. These days, formulas and other things can help make the baby healthy enough, not be a major problem. Sometimes you can have anterior pituitary tumors that can cause some problems there. And clinical signs usually are problems with lactation, lack of menses, so not having a menstrual cycle, infertility in females, and then in males sometimes also impotence. So there's some other effects there with prolactin. And so again, here's that same chart showing anterior versus posterior pituitary and what happens with the hormones they produce. And there's a second page. All right. So this is kind of a point where I'm going to take a quick break and just explain kind of how lab's going to work. I already mentioned we're going to come into lab. You're going to be able to kind of ask some quick questions. I'll be there early if you want to ask me questions ahead of time, or we'll spend about 15 minutes probably going over this past week's lecture, make sure everything's clear. For review, make sure you understand how the study guide works, how mastering A&P works, particularly this week. And then we're going to spend some time doing an endocrine system lab, making sure you understand the safety rules, how you can come in to lab on your own, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate to do that. And then we'll spend the last few minutes of lab actually going over next week's information and make sure you're comfortable with what you need to learn for next week. It's really important that we have homework and quizzes that are available on Mastering A&P. We'll go over how to access that specifically on Friday and make sure everybody has access. There is a quiz due on Friday, January 10th by midnight. If you've not had a chance to do that yet, I encourage you to do so after you go through the lecture. It will be remain open for another week, so really it's sort of due more like the 17th, but don't forget about it. Overall, you're going to get lots of points for these quizzes, so make sure you check them out. They're actually worth more than the final exam. Okay, so to move on and continue, now that we've gone through the hypothalamus and the pituitary, let's go through some of the organs that are downstream of the pituitary and some other endocrine organs in general. The first one will be the thyroid. Okay, so the thyroid is shaped kind of like a butterfly. We'll look at it on the human model. That's the anatomical model in the lab. And basically it sits in the neck, kind of in the anterior side of the neck, right on top of the trachea, just inferior to the larynx. And it has a few parts. It has an isthmus, some follicles, and some follicular cells. We'll look at some of these cell types in the lab. It basically has a colloid in a repeating structural unit. We'll see the picture in a second. And this colloid is basically a fluid area. Okay, and if you remember what a colloid is from the chemistry chapter, it's sort of a little bit thicker, more jello-like or gelatin-like version of a fluid. We have this open space that contains the hormone and various fluid, and it's surrounded by follicular cells, and there's areas in between that contain parafollicular cells. Okay, so here's a picture. Here's the bloodstream, the aorta coming out of the heart. This is kind of the neck. This person's neck is roughly shaped like this. Their shoulders kind of come across like this. And so here is your trachea, all right, and then the thyroid is that butterfly shape right in front of it. All right, so a microscopic view of the thyroid, we have these repeating follicles. Inside of each follicle consists of these colloid spaces, okay, or we can just call it the colloid. Around that are the follicular cells that actually secrete the thyroid hormone into the colloid. And then we have parafollicular cells here that secrete some other hormones that are important for thyroid function. Okay, so thyroid hormone is the body's major metabolic hormone. It's very, very important for regulating all aspects of metabolism, and consequently can affect the output or the ability of the body to respond to other hormones. It's found in two different forms. You don't have to know the specific names, but basically kind of an inactive and an active form. Both are iodine-containing peptide-based hormones. Okay, but if you remember, this is the one exception that actually is lipophilic. So it can go inside of target cells and affect the target cells itself instead of using a second messenger. Okay. The other important thing to remember is that it actually uses iodine. All right. So thyroid hormone basically affects almost every cell in the body because every cell has some type of metabolism. It enters the target cell and binds to intracellular receptors within the nucleus to turn on different metabolic genes to change the cell metabolism. The effects of the thyroid hormone can include increase in basal metabolic rate as well as the production of heat. So sometimes that's called the calorogenic effect. We really don't have to know that name or that term for this class. But basically the thyroid hormone affects metabolism of every cell. It's going to regulate tissue growth and development. So for the skeletal system, for the nervous system to develop, as well as the reproductive system to develop and actually be able to function, we have to have proper levels of thyroid hormone. It's also very important for helping to maintain blood pressure, increasing adrenergic receptors in the blood vessels so we can respond to changes. It's synthesized in a very special way. The thyroid gland stores hormone externally in this follicle lumen, and basically it's triggered by the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, that TSH that came from the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary. And so there's 7 different steps that are involved in production of thyroid hormone. I don't expect you to know them stepwise, but I want you to understand the general idea of how this works. So what happens basically is the thyroglobulin, okay, this kind of precursor, is made and discharged into the lumen, the open space of the follicle, so the colloid space. Iodine is then going to be trapped, okay, taken into the cell and released into the colloid, into that open space of the lumen. Remember, a lumen is just a hole or an open space. And then the iodide oxide is oxidized, okay, into iodine. And iodine then gets attached basically to the precursor of thyroid hormone to actually finally make thyroid hormone. And then once it's finally converted into the active form, it can be released back through the thyroid cells. Okay, so think about it in the blood. Iodine comes into these follicular cells. These are the follicular cells. This is the colloid, so the lumen, the open space. So what's going to happen is iodine is going to come inside the cell, moves across the cell into this open space. Okay. Thyroglobulin, which is kind of a precursor, is going to be made by the cell. Okay, so here's the endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum contains ribosomes that make that protein. It gets secreted by the Golgi apparatus, which makes it go to these vesicles and go outside of the cell into this lumen, the colloid space. And then once we have both iodine and this precursor present, what's going to happen is we get an interconversion until we get a more active form, and then the active thyroid hormone can then be taken back in by the cell via a vesicle and moved right across until it's released into the bloodstream. Okay, so that's kind of the level of depth that I want you to understand how we synthesize thyroid hormone. Big thing here is we have to have iodine to get proper synthesis of the thyroid hormone, and that the thyroid hormone is actually made and put together in that colloid, inside that open lumen space of each follicle. All right, so kind of continue with the process. Thyroid hormone is regulated by negative feedback, so if you have decreased levels of thyroid hormone, it stimulates the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone. The rising TH levels provide negative feedback to block TSH, just like every other hormone we've talked about so far. That's an anterior pituitary hormone. The TSH can also be inhibited by GHIH. We already talked about that inhibiting hormone, as well as dopamine, and increased levels of some other things in the blood. So basically, here's how it's regulated. TRH is produced by the hypothalamus. It affects the anterior pituitary, which causes the release of TSH, which triggers the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. All right, and here this shows some of the effects of thyroid hormone in different parts of the body, different systems. So what happens when you have thyroid problems? It's actually becoming pretty common in different parts of the world in different ways. So you can first get hyposecretion, not hyper, but hyposecretion. And when this happens, symptoms are going to include low metabolic rate, dry skin, and puffy eyes, things like that. And if you get not enough iodine, you may also end up with a goiter. You're good. Come on in. About 5 more minutes. You're welcome to come on in.
Are you
You're
the
good.
adjunct instructor?
Yes, I am.
What do you teach?
Will Jackson. I teach 201 and 202, anatomy and physiology. Yeah. I'm doing a lecture. I teach in Clanton as well, and so I was just doing a video lecture for one of the online classes. So.
Oh, okay. You're
You're good.
online also?
Yes.
Okay.
So you're. Let's see.